Hi everyone, so this is a video answer for a question about importing blend shapes from Maya into Unity. And for this, it's a little bit complicated getting it to work. There's a couple of tricks, and I thought it would be easier to explain this if I did it as a video instead of trying to write it out in text. So here it goes. All right, so here is the model that we're trying to work with. You can see we've got a nice little run animation on her, and part of that is some facial expression. It's a little bit of a blink going on right here, and that part is done with blend shapes. Right. And so I think what we'll do first is let's just try doing a straight regular export of this model and animation as an FBX into Unity and just see what that looks like, just using the regular kinds of settings. Alright, so I'm exporting this out into my assets folder in my Unity project, and you can see I've got animation checked, I've got bake animation checked. Right here I've set my keys from 1 to 130. Could go back maybe later and check and see exactly what the range is. That's just defaulting to what the the whole animation range is, but it doesn't matter for right now. And then I've also got deformed models checked. It's going to export the skin weights, which we need, of course, and it's also going to export the blend shapes. So that all sounds pretty good. Let's go ahead out here and save this as Rachel run 1.fbx. Click export all, and it will export her out into my Unity project. Now you can see a number of warnings are going to pop up in the FBX export when I do this. Some of these are fine, some of them are things that we should maybe take a look at. So there's this warning about the skin definition. This is pretty common, about being unable to find bind poses for different joints. These two are also pretty common, where it changes the curved tangent type, just because the tangent types that Maya uses are not exactly the same as the ones that it uses in FBX. So it will adjust these slightly. Complex animation baked, this is normal, of course. So what this means is that you're taking the animation that's on your control handles, IK handles, and so forth, and is baking that down into the joints, which is what's supposed to happen. This one about non-orthogonal matrix support is a little bit unusual, and so this might cause some problems when we get into Unity, so that's something to keep an eye on. Let's close that and pop back over to Unity and see what it actually looks like. It's importing now, and let's go ahead and click on it and take a look. So you can see that the run animation is working. Yes, it is a little bit slow, but that's something that's going to get fixed later. And so that means that the skeleton animation has gotten baked correctly. The skins are getting baked correctly. Let's see if we can zoom in to the face and see about these facial rig blend shapes. So I don't see the eyes opening and closing, so the eyelids should be changing here. There is this odd little twitch that's happening in her lower eyelid, but the main eyelids aren't opening and closing. So that's the problem that we have to go ahead and debug. So let's go ahead and just delete that one and pop back to Maya and see if we can fix this. So usually when you run into something like this in Maya, where you have animation that's working and doesn't export out to Unity, one of the cases could be that you're using an animation type that just doesn't export, using like end cloth animation or dynamics or something like that. But if you're using regular joints and blend shapes, when it doesn't come through, a lot of the time that's because the exporter is not being smart enough to bake down the animation from your control curves into the actual joints and blend shapes. All right, so we can take a look in here. Let's bring up the NURBS curve so we can look at this rig. And as usual, the actual animation data is not on the joints inside, it's on these control curves. So for example, right here we've got this control curve, which is the knee, and that has all those keyframes on it, controlling the bending of the knee. If I make the joints active, if I select the actual knee joint, you see there are no keyframes on here, which is correct. That's what we want. That's the way we want to be doing this when we're animating. So all of the animation is stored on this control curve. In Unity, it needs to have all the animation data, rotation data baked into the joints. And so what happens in the export process is it takes all the data that's on each one of these control curves and bakes it down. It applies it into the joint. So when all of this stuff shows up in Unity, none of these control curves in your rig are still there or are still important. But all that matters is the data that's in the joints. So what the exporter is supposed to be doing is taking all the sophisticated stuff that you've done with your rig and then baking it down into the underlying information in the joints and the blend shapes. So sometimes it's not smart enough to do that correctly, and so we have to do it ourselves. And I think that's what's going on here. So we're going to do this in a couple of steps. The first part is we're going to bake the animation for the skeleton. So that's what most of these controls in the rig are doing. And for that, we're just going to pick one of the skeleton joints. I'm going to tap up on the keyboard to walk up the hierarchy to make sure that I'm getting to the root of the skeleton, because I want to bake the data into every joint in the whole skeleton, make sure I'm getting the whole thing. Then I'm going to go up to the edit menu, and then go to keys and bake simulation. Now let's pull up the options for that. Under hierarchy, I'm going to choose below. So what that means is it's going to bake data into the joint I have selected, which is the root joint, and all of the joints below that in the hierarchy. All right, so if I only had selected here, it would only bake data for just one joint, not everything else. So I want that left as below. And I think for my purposes right now, I can leave everything else just at the defaults. So now I'll go down here and click Bake. And it's going to go through every frame in my animation. It's going to evaluate the pose of every joint in the skeleton at that frame. And it's going to insert key data for that joint for every single frame. So obviously this is really inefficient, and it's going to be impossible for you to edit the animation after you've done this step. So now's usually a good time to just save this as something else. Let's call this one Rachel running baked animation .ma. Alright, so that way I'm not messing with my original file, because obviously I'm always going to want to have the ability to go back in and tweak the animation and so forth. So after I've done this step, it's kind of irreversible for this file, so that's why I want to keep a separate file. Alright, so the neat thing about this is that now that I've baked all this data into the animation, into the joints, you can see that the animation still looks the same. But I can also go through here and delete curves out of my control rig. In fact, I could delete almost all of them. And you can see the animation still works. All right, so I don't actually need the control rig anymore at this stage. I'm going to go ahead and hide my joints and also hide polygons. So I'm only looking at the control curves. And I'm going to select all of these control curves and get rid of them. The only ones I'm going to leave for right now are the facial rig controls, because those have not been baked yet. Because these control blend shapes. They don't control joints. They don't control anything in that skeleton. So I've only baked data that went into that skeleton. I still need to deal with this part, and that's what we're going to do in this this next step. All right, so let's bring the polygons and the joints back in, and just play this again to verify that it's still working. All right, so the run cycle is still going on. You can see the blink is still happening. And you can see what's actually activating the blink is this control, blink control. And so in the rig, we've got this setup. So it's just a horizontal slider when it slides to the left with a value of 0 in its translation. That means that the eyelids are closed. And then when it slides over to the right with a translation of, what's that, 1.6, I guess, then that means that the eyelids are open. So what we need to do is now bake that data down into the blend shape. So this is a little bit trickier because there's not like an easy thing that we can just click on and select and use the bake simulation command like we do with the joints. We have to go find it in the hypergraph. So for this, we'll go up to Window, Hypergraph, Connections, and you can see I've got my blink control selected. You can see what the things are that it's doing. So over here on the left we have all the animation curves that are driving that blink control, and then that goes into an animation blend node, and then that goes into the actual blend shape node. And this value right here, the blend amount, that's the thing that's actually getting driven. You can kind of maybe watch this as we go through right here. So at the time when there's a blink happening, you can see that value is changing between 1 and 0. So that's the thing that we actually want to bake. So we can use that same bake simulation command, and we can use it on stuff that we've selected in the hypergraph, just like we can use it on stuff that we've selected in the main perspective view. All right, so in the hypergraph here, I'm going to pick the actual blend node, go up to Edit and Keys, and Bake Simulation here. This one, I'm going to change the hierarchy down to just selected. I don't think there's anything below that node in the hierarchy, but if there is, it doesn't need to get baked, so I'm just going to select it for this part, and then hit bake again. So once again, it's going to go through every frame in my animation and evaluate it. And you can see my hypergraph has suddenly changed. And the main thing is that the link between blink control, this curve in my rig, and the blend shape has now gotten broken. Right? So these aren't even connected anymore. And I have two new animation curves that are attached into my blend shape. So at this point, I can go ahead and just delete those parts of my control rig too, and I can close my hypergraph. Hopefully I don't need it anymore. And let's scrub through the animation. All right, so you can see that the eyelids are still working, and everything else is still working. So that's really good. There's one more cleanup thing that I can do at this point. Over here is a group called Blend Shapes Geo. So this had the original geometry that went into forming this this move of the eyelids closing, and I don't actually need that anymore. That geometry is mesh data is now built into the blend shape node, so I can actually get rid of the original source for that. All right, so that should still be working. That's good. And I can also get rid of these two things. So these are two IK handles that I don't need. So animation's still working, but I've just been able to bake all that data down and get rid of all this sort of extra stuff. And this is actually kind of a good thing to do before exporting anyway, because the FBX export, particularly if you use the export all version of it, it will really export everything. So you'll get a thing in Unity that also has all this extra rig stuff in it that you can't use, and you don't need to have it in Unity, but it just throws in a whole bunch of extra empty transforms and dummy geometry things and stuff like that. So it sometimes is a nice practice, no matter what, to just kind of clean up your scene before you do your export. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and save that and then export it again. So we'll do export all, bring up the options. Let's call this one Rachel running 2.fbx. And again, I've got animation checked. Bake animation, I should probably turn that off because I've already baked it. And I need deformed models, skins, and blend shapes. Okay, so exported. I got different warnings this time. So the same skin definition warnings about my bind poses, and then this warning about constraints exporting. Nah, that's strange. I actually don't know whether there's any constraints in this scene anymore, but that's okay. It just means that it didn't export them, which is fine because I didn't need them, if there were any actually in there. All right, well, let's go back to Unity and see how it looks. All right, so let's go ahead and click on and take a look at that. All right, so the run is still working, looks like. And let's try zooming in a little closer to the face to see if that's working. So that's more or less working. Partly working. It looks like this the right eye is blinking correctly and the left eye kind of isn't, like it's inverted in some way. So I'm not sure what's going on with that exactly, but we're definitely closer.